Every town has a secret, but some secrets run so deep that they hide in plain sight for years, decades even, waiting for the right moment to surface. This story begins with just such a secret, buried beneath the routine of daily life in a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. The town of Millbrook was an ordinary place, the kind you'd drive through without a second glance. Its back streets were narrow and lined with weathered brick buildings that had seen better days. The town square was small, dominated by a single oak tree that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Every morning, lives flowed with the same predictable routine. Coffee at May's Diner, newspapers from the corner store, brief nods of acknowledgement between neighbors who had lived side by side for years but never really knew each other. Nobody really knew each other that well in Millbrook. It wasn't unfriendliness exactly. It was more like everyone had their own invisible bubble, their own priorities in their own small world. People talked about the weather, complained about the potholes on Main Street, and discussed whose turn it was to organize the annual 4th of July barbecue. But deeper conversations, personal histories, those were rare as snow in July. The post office clerk, Mrs. Henderson, had worked the same job for 37 years and could tell you the mail patterns of every resident. The barber, Tony, knew everyone's preferred haircut and their opinions on the local baseball team. The pharmacist, Dr. Mills, filled prescriptions and offered gentle advice about minor ailments. But none of them really knew the stories their neighbors carried, the dreams they'd abandoned, or the secrets they'd buried. But the old man living in the stone house on the edge of town, Martin Sullivan, he was different, only nobody noticed. His house sat at the end of Elm Street, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the streetlights ended. It was a solid, unremarkable structure, built of gray stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The small front yard was meticulously maintained, not a single weed in sight. The grass cut to a precise length, the single flower bed arranged with military precision. But it was the kind of perfection that spoke of discipline rather than love of gardening. Martin himself was 73 years old, though he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. His gray hair was always neatly combed, his clothes clean but faded from countless washings. He wore the same type of clothing every day, plain khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and worn leather boots that had been resoled more times than most people owned shoes. His face was weathered, lined with wrinkles that spoke of years under harsh sun and difficult conditions. But his eyes were sharp and alert, constantly scanning his surroundings in a way that suggested old habits die hard. Every morning at exactly 7:15, Martin would walk through the town square. He moved with a purpose that seemed almost out of place in Millbrook's leisurely pace. His route never varied. Down Elm Street, through the square, past the diner, around the block, and back home. The entire walk took precisely 23 minutes. He never stopped to chat with anyone, never lingered to read the bulletin board announcements, never even acknowledged the few people who were out early enough to cross his path. With his gray hair and worn clothes, when he walked through the town square in the mornings, nobody would even glance at him. He was so ordinary, so much a part of the background scenery, that no one would spare him a single look. The morning dog walkers would pass him without a word. The early commuters heading to jobs in the next town over wouldn't even register his presence. He was invisible in the way that only the elderly can be in a youth-obsessed world. Or so they thought, because that faded tattoo on Martin's left arm, usually hidden beneath his long sleeves, was about to unlock a past that none of the townspeople could have ever imagined. It was a small mark, barely visible unless you knew where to look, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and secrets that had been buried for nearly 5 decades. The townspeople never questioned anyone much, and they had never been curious about Martin's past. In Millbrook, people respected privacy, sometimes to a fault. If someone didn't volunteer information about themselves, well, that was their business. Martin had been living in the stone house for 12 years, ever since he'd quietly moved to town and paid cash for the property. He'd never caused any trouble, never complained about anything, never asked for help with anything. He was the ideal neighbor, quiet, clean, and completely undemanding. The town clerk, Sarah Morrison, remembered when Martin had first applied for residency. His paperwork had been in perfect order, his references impeccable though vague. He'd listed his previous address as simply various locations and his occupation as retired. When she'd asked what he'd retired from, he'd simply said, "Government work," in a tone that didn't invite further questions. She'd processed his application without another thought. That was until Jared Coleman moved to town. Jared was 28 years old, a freelance journalist who'd grown tired of the frantic pace of city life and decided to try small-town living. He'd bought a small house on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the town square, and set up a home office where he could work on the novel he'd been promising himself he'd write for years. Unlike the longtime residents of Millbrook, Jared was genuinely curious about his new home. He wanted to know the history, the stories, the characters that made the town unique. He'd spent his first few weeks exploring, taking long walks through the neighborhoods, stopping in at local businesses, striking up conversations with anyone who seemed willing to talk. He'd learned about the town's founding in 1887, about the flood of 1952 that had nearly wiped out Main Street, about the factory that had closed in the 1980s and taken half the town's jobs with it. He'd heard stories about local legends, family feuds that had simmered for generations, and the politics of the school board that could get heated enough to rival any big city council meeting. But whenever he asked about Martin Sullivan, the responses were always the same: polite, but dismissive. "Oh, Martin, he's just a quiet old man. Keeps to himself. Nice enough, I suppose, but not much of a talker." The townspeople would shrug and change the subject, not out of any malice, but simply because there didn't seem to be anything interesting to say about the man. "Don't bother trying to get to know him," Mrs. Henderson at the post office had advised when Jared mentioned his interest in meeting all his neighbors. "He's been here over a decade, and I don't think I've heard him say more than 'good morning' and 'thank you' in all that time. Some people just prefer their privacy, you know? There's nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing to learn there either." But Jared didn't know yet how wrong they were. The first time Jared really noticed Martin was on a Tuesday morning in early October. The leaves on the old oak tree in the square were just beginning to turn, and there was a crisp quality to the air that spoke of autumn's approach. Jared had decided to walk to the grocery store instead of driving, partly for the exercise and partly because he was still learning to appreciate the slower pace of small-town life. Tony's Market was the kind of place that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. Narrow aisles, creaky wooden floors, and handwritten signs advertising local produce. Mrs. Kowalski, the owner's wife, was restocking the canned goods section when Jared arrived, and she greeted him with the kind of warm smile that had become one of his favorite things about Millbrook. "Morning, Jared. How's the riding going?" "Slowly but surely," he replied, grabbing a shopping basket. "I think I'm finally getting into the rhythm of things here." It was while he was debating between 2 different brands of coffee that he noticed Martin. The older man was in the produce section, carefully selecting apples with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of old habits. He picked up each apple, examined it from multiple angles, and either placed it in his basket or returned it to the display. There was something almost ritualistic about the process. But it wasn't Martin's shopping habits that caught Jared's attention. It was the way he moved. Despite his age, Martin's posture was ramrod straight, his shoulders square, his steps measured and purposeful. Even in the mundane task of grocery shopping, there was a quality to his movement that suggested discipline, training, awareness. Jared found himself watching, intrigued by this contradiction between the man's unremarkable appearance and his remarkably controlled way of moving through the world. Martin finished selecting his apples and moved on to the bread aisle. His path through the store was efficient, economical, with no wasted motion or backtracking. He knew exactly what he wanted and where to find it. It was when Martin reached for a loaf of bread on the top shelf that Jared saw it. A flash of faded blue ink on the man's left forearm as his sleeve rode up. The tattoo was partially visible for just a moment, but it was enough to make Jared's heart skip a beat. He'd seen that symbol before. Not in person, but in the military history books he'd read while researching an article about veterans' issues the previous year. It was a distinctive design. An eagle perched on an anchor, surrounded by specific lettering that he couldn't quite make out from across the aisle. But the overall composition was unmistakable. This wasn't just any old tattoo. This was a mark that only very special people carried. People who had earned the right to wear it through training that broke most candidates, through missions that most people couldn't even imagine, through service that demanded everything they had to give. Jared felt a surge of excitement mixed with uncertainty. Was he mistaken? Was his imagination running away with him? But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. Martin's bearing, his precise movements, his apparent comfort with solitude, even his choice to live on the edge of town where he could see anyone approaching. It all made sense if you looked at it through the right lens. Martin completed his shopping and headed for the checkout counter. Jared quickly grabbed the items he needed and got in line behind him, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he should ask. The elderly cashier, Mr. Peterson, greeted Martin with the kind of polite but distant courtesy that characterized most of the town's interactions with him. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan. Find everything you needed?" "Yes, thank you," Martin replied, his voice gravelly but clear. He paid in cash, as always, and accepted his receipt with a small nod. Jared made his decision in that moment. As Martin headed for the door, Jared quickly paid for his own items and followed him outside. The older man was walking at his usual measured pace toward the town square, and Jared had to quicken his step to catch up. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice slightly breathless. "Mr. Sullivan?" Martin stopped and turned, his expression neutral but alert. Up close, Jared could see the depth of experience in the man's eyes, a quality that spoke of having seen things that most people never would, of having made decisions that carried life and death consequences. "Yes?" Martin's response was polite but cautious. Jared hesitated for a moment, suddenly unsure of himself. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe his eyes had been playing tricks on him. But something about Martin's stillness, his complete focus on the conversation, suggested that this was a man accustomed to evaluating situations quickly and accurately. "I'm Jared Coleman. I moved to town a few weeks ago." He extended his hand, which Martin shook briefly but firmly. "I couldn't help but notice, well, I thought I saw—" He took a deep breath and decided to be direct. "That tattoo on your arm, isn't that from 1st Reconnaissance Battalion?" The change in Martin's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes sharpened slightly, and for just a moment, Jared caught a glimpse of the man Martin had been decades earlier, alert, assessing, ready. Then, just as quickly, the neutral mask slipped back into place. "You have a good eye," Martin said quietly. After a pause that seemed to stretch for hours, he added, "Yes, it is." "I thought so." Jared's excitement was barely contained. "I wrote an article about military history last year, and I learned about the different unit insignias. First Recon, that's Marines, right? Force Reconnaissance." Martin's eyes opened slightly, and for a moment he stood as if the winds of the past had hit his face, carrying with them the weight of memories he'd worked hard to keep buried. Without making a sound, he nodded his head slightly. Then, after what seemed like an internal struggle, he gave a brief answer. "Yes, once upon a time." The phrase hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jared sensed that he was standing at the edge of something significant, but he also recognized that Martin was a man who chose his words carefully and revealed information only when he was ready to do so. "Where did you serve?" Jared asked softly, his journalist's instincts warring with his respect for the older man's obvious reluctance to discuss his past. Martin looked at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh not just the question, but the man who was asking it. Finally, lowering his eyes to the ground, he spoke in a voice so quiet that Jared had to lean closer to hear. "Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, places that didn't officially exist on any mission reports." He paused, then added, "Deep reconnaissance, long-range patrols, the kind of operations that, well, the kind that people weren't supposed to know about." These few words hit Jared like a physical blow. He'd read enough military history to understand what Martin was talking about. The classified missions, the operations that were conducted without official acknowledgement. The men who had been sent into hostile territory with little support and even less recognition. There was something in Martin's eyes as he spoke, a mixture of pain, loss, and pride that spoke of experiences that had shaped him in ways that could never be fully explained to someone who hadn't been there. But there was also something else, a wariness that suggested he was already regretting having said as much as he had. "I should get home," Martin said, stepping back slightly. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Coleman." "Jared," he said automatically, "and thank you for telling me that. I know it probably wasn't easy." Martin nodded once, then turned and continued his walk toward home, leaving Jared standing on the sidewalk with his mind spinning and his heart racing. But Jared didn't know yet that those few words Martin had shared were actually just the beginning of the town's biggest secret. Over the following days, Jared found himself unable to stop thinking about his brief conversation with Martin. He'd gone home and spent hours researching everything he could find about force reconnaissance operations in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War era. What he learned only deepened his respect for the quiet man who lived at the end of Elm Street. Force Recon Marines were the elite of the elite, specially trained for missions that required them to operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. They were the eyes and ears of the Marine Corps, gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance, and carrying out operations that were often so classified that they remained secret for decades. The training was brutal, the missions were dangerous, and the casualty rates were higher than almost any other military specialty. And Martin Sullivan, the man his neighbors barely noticed, had been one of them. The knowledge changed everything about how Jared saw Martin's daily routine. That precise morning walk wasn't just the habit of a retiree with too much time on his hands. It was a patrol route, a way of staying aware of his environment and maintaining the kind of physical and mental discipline that had kept him alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The meticulously maintained yard wasn't just fastidiousness, it was a clear field of fire, a way of ensuring that no one could approach his house without being seen. The way he positioned himself in public spaces, always with his back to a wall and clear sightlines to all entrances, wasn't paranoia. It was the kind of situational awareness that had been drilled into him through years of training and experience. When Jared looked at Martin now, he didn't see an unremarkable old man. He saw a warrior who had served his country in ways that most people couldn't imagine, who had made sacrifices that would never be publicly acknowledged, and who had chosen to live out his retirement in quiet anonymity. But he also saw something else, a profound loneliness that came from carrying stories that could never be told, from having experiences that couldn't be shared with people who had never faced life-and-death situations, from being surrounded by neighbors who saw him as ordinary when he was anything but. Jared's first instinct was to tell someone, to share this incredible discovery with his new neighbors. Surely they would be as amazed as he was to learn that they had been living alongside a genuine hero all these years. He started with his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Campbell, a retired teacher who had lived in Millbrook her entire life and seemed to know everyone's business. "Mrs. Campbell," he said one evening, as they both happened to be getting their mail at the same time, "do you know Martin Sullivan very well?" She looked up from sorting through her letters, her expression mildly curious. "Martin? Not really, dear. He's been here for years, but he's never been much of a social butterfly." "Why do you ask?" "Well, I had an interesting conversation with him the other day." "Did you know he was in the military?" Mrs. Campbell shrugged. "I suppose I might have heard something about that. A lot of men his age served in some capacity back in the day. Vietnam era, wasn't it? Most of them don't like to talk about it much." "But, Mrs. Campbell, he wasn't just any soldier. He was force reconnaissance. That's like being a Navy SEAL, but for the Marines. These guys went on missions that were so classified they're still secret today." She looked at him with the kind of patient expression that retired teachers reserve for students who are getting a little too excited about a subject. "That's nice, dear. I'm sure he did his duty like so many others. But you know, a lot of men come back from war with stories that grow a little in the telling. Not that I'm saying Martin is lying," she added quickly, "but sometimes memory can be flexible." Jared felt a flash of frustration. She wasn't understanding the significance of what he was trying to tell her. "No, you don't understand. I saw his tattoo. It's not something you can fake. And the way he carries himself, the way he moves, there's something different about him." "Well, I suppose everyone is different in their own way," Mrs. Campbell said diplomatically. "But honestly, Jared, I think you might be reading too much into things. Martin Sullivan is just a quiet old man who likes to keep to himself. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing particularly special about it either." He had similar conversations with other neighbors over the next few days, with virtually identical results. The barber, Tony, listened politely and said, "Yeah, I heard he was in the service. Good for him. A lot of guys were back then." The pharmacist, Dr. Mills, nodded and said, "Military service is admirable, but it doesn't make someone special. We all did our jobs." But what Jared was telling them was beyond the townspeople's imagination. So at first, nobody believed him. Or rather, they believed that Martin had been in the military, but they couldn't grasp the significance of what that meant in his particular case. To them, all military service was more or less the same. You went where they sent you, you did what they told you, and then you came home and got on with your life. They couldn't understand that there was a difference between being drafted into the army and serving as a cook in a supply depot and volunteering for force reconnaissance and conducting classified operations in hostile territory. They couldn't see that Martin's quiet demeanor wasn't just personal preference. It was the result of years of training that had taught him to blend in, to observe without being noticed, to carry himself in a way that wouldn't draw attention. However, day by day, Martin's walks through the town square began to seem more meaningful to Jared, and gradually, his enthusiasm began to have an effect on others. People started paying attention to things they had never noticed before. They began to really watch Martin as he made his daily rounds, and slowly, they started to see what Jared had been trying to tell them. Mrs. Henderson at the post office was the first to really notice. "You know," she said to Jared one morning as he was mailing a letter, "I've been watching Martin Sullivan like you suggested, and there is something different about him. Yesterday, when that group of teenagers was being loud and rowdy near the square, I saw him position himself so he could see all of them while keeping an eye on the street. Most people would have just ignored them or crossed to the other side, but he was watching them like he was assessing whether they were a threat." The barber's wife, Elena, had noticed something too. "Tony thinks I'm crazy," she confided to Jared when he stopped by for a haircut. "But I swear that man never makes eye contact with anyone unless he chooses to. And when he does look at you, it's like he's seeing everything, not just your face, but everything around you, everything that might be important. It's like he's always on guard, always ready for something." Even old Mr. Peterson at the grocery store had started to see Martin differently. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told Jared one afternoon, "and you're right about how he moves. It's not just that he's in good shape for his age. There's something purposeful about everything he does, like every step is planned, every movement has a reason." The change in perception was gradual, but undeniable. People who had been dismissing Martin as just another elderly resident were beginning to see him as Jared saw him, as someone whose presence in their town was far more significant than they had ever imagined. The transformation really began to accelerate after an incident that occurred on a Thursday morning in late October. A group of young soldiers from the nearby military base had come to town for a day of leave. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly enjoying their time off from the strict discipline of military life. They'd been drinking at the local bar the night before, and were now wandering through the town square, joking and laughing with the kind of energy that only young people possess. Martin happened to be making his morning walk when the soldiers appeared. Jared was watching from across the street, having developed a habit of timing his own errands to coincide with Martin's routine. He saw the moment when the soldiers noticed the older man, saw them take in his bearing, his steady gait, the way he carried himself. One of the soldiers, a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 22, stepped forward and came to attention. Without hesitation, he rendered a crisp military salute. "Good morning, sir," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the square. Martin stopped walking. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, and Jared could see the conflict playing out on his face. Then, slowly, he returned the salute with a precision that spoke of decades of muscle memory. "Good morning, Marine," Martin replied, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there in his previous conversations with townspeople. The young soldier's eyes widened slightly. "Force recon?" he asked, having obviously noticed something in Martin's bearing that marked him as special operations. Martin nodded once, briefly. "My grandfather was 1st Recon," the soldier said, his voice now filled with respect. "He served in Vietnam. He always said that Force Recon Marines were the toughest sons of bitches in the Corps." Martin's expression softened slightly. "Your grandfather was a good man then. We all were. in our own way." The soldier nodded, then asked, "Any advice for a young Marine, sir?" Martin looked at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Finally he said, "Remember that the mission comes first, but your men come first too. Take care of each other, and the mission will take care of itself. And remember," he paused, his eyes distant, "remember that sometimes the hardest part isn't the fighting. It's coming home and learning how to live with what you've seen and done." The soldier nodded seriously, clearly understanding that he was receiving wisdom from someone who had earned the right to give it. "Semper Fi, sir," he said. "Semper Fi, Marine," Martin replied. The brief exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact on the watching townspeople was profound. They had just witnessed a glimpse of who Martin Sullivan really was, not just a quiet old man, but a leader, a warrior, someone who commanded respect from people who understood what real service meant. Word of the encounter spread quickly through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. By the end of the day, everyone in town had heard about it, and the story grew with each telling. But rather than diminishing Martin's stature, the attention seemed to enhance it. People began to look at him with new eyes, to see the man behind the carefully maintained facade of ordinariness. But the real surprise hadn't come yet. The call came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the incident with the young soldiers. Jared was in his kitchen, making coffee and planning his day, when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles arriving in town. It was an unusual sound for Millbrook, the rumble of powerful engines, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires, the kind of purposeful noise that suggested official business. He looked out his window and saw them, a convoy of black SUVs making their way down Main Street toward Elm Street. There were at least 6 vehicles, all identical, all moving with the kind of precision that suggested military or government operation. Jared grabbed his jacket and headed outside, his curiosity overwhelming his common sense. He wasn't the only one. Neighbors were emerging from their houses up and down the street, all drawn by the unusual activity. The convoy stopped at the end of Elm Street, right in front of Martin's stone house. Car doors opened simultaneously, and men began to emerge. They were all roughly the same age, late 60s to early 70s, and they all moved with the same economical precision that Jared had learned to recognize in Martin. These were Martin's old friends, his brothers in arms, and they had come to Millbrook for a reunion that was decades in the making. The townspeople watched in amazement as the men approached Martin's front door. They didn't need to knock. Martin was already standing on his porch, as if he had been expecting them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, one by one, the visitors began to smile, and the careful military bearing gave way to genuine emotion. "Jesus Christ, Marty," one of them said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We finally found you." And then they were embracing, these tough old warriors who had shared experiences that most people couldn't imagine, who had trusted each other with their lives in places where death was always just a heartbeat away. Some of them were crying, others were laughing, but all of them were clearly overwhelmed by the reunion. The townspeople watched from a respectful distance, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something private and profound. But they couldn't help but hear fragments of the conversation as the men talked over each other, years of separation dissolving in minutes of shared memory. "We heard about Tommy last year. Sarah's been looking for you for 20 years. Remember that mission in '68 when we thought we were all going to die? The guys at Quantico said you just disappeared after you retired." Gradually, the conversation moved inside, but not before one of the visitors noticed the watching neighbors. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he had been an officer. "Excuse me," He called out to the small crowd that had gathered. "Are you folks Mr. Sullivan's neighbors?" Mrs. Campbell stepped forward, suddenly feeling like she was representing the entire town. "Yes, we are. I'm Dorothy Campbell." The man smiled, and his whole face transformed. "I'm Colonel James Mitchell, retired. These men and I served with Martin in Vietnam. We've been looking for him for a long time." We didn't know," Mrs. Campbell said, her voice uncertain. "I mean, we knew he was in the military, but we didn't realize—" Colonel Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, I hope you understand that you've been living next door to one of the finest Marines who ever served his country. Martin Sullivan saved more lives than I can count, including mine. He led missions that were so classified they're still secret today, and he did it with a courage and integrity that was an inspiration to everyone who served with him." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "When Martin retired, he just vanished. Didn't want any fanfare, didn't want any recognition. He just wanted to disappear and live quietly. We respected that for a long time, but we're all getting older, and we decided we needed to find him, to make sure he knew how much he meant to us." The colonel's words hung in the air, and Jared could see the impact they were having on his neighbors. These were people who had lived next to Martin for over a decade, who had dismissed him as unremarkable, who had never bothered to learn his story. Now they were discovering that they had been in the presence of genuine heroism and had never even known it. What kind of missions?" Mrs. Henderson asked hesitantly. Colonel Mitchell smiled grimly. "The kind that kept a lot of American boys alive, ma'am. The kind that gathered intelligence, that changed the course of battles. The kind that—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The kind that required men to go into places where they weren't expected to come back." The crowd was silent, absorbing the implications of what they were hearing. "Martin was our team leader," another of the visitors added. "He brought us all home when everyone said it was impossible. More than once." As the day wore on, more stories emerged. The visitors stayed for hours, and gradually some of the townspeople found the courage to approach them with questions. What they learned painted a picture of Martin Sullivan that was almost impossible to reconcile with the quiet man they thought they knew. He had been decorated multiple times for valor, though he had never mentioned it to anyone. He had been offered promotions that would have taken him out of the field, but he had turned them down because he wouldn't abandon his men. He had been wounded in action on 3 separate occasions and had returned to duty each time as soon as he was physically able. But perhaps most importantly, he had been a leader who had earned the absolute loyalty and respect of the men who served under him. Every one of his former teammates had a story about a time when Martin had saved their life, had made a decision that had kept them alive, had put himself at risk to protect them. He was the kind of officer who would never ask his men to do something he wouldn't do himself, Colonel Mitchell explained to a group of fascinated townspeople. And he was the kind of man who would take responsibility for everything that went wrong and give credit for everything that went right. As evening approached, the visitors began to prepare for departure. They had achieved what they came for. They had found their old friend and had been able to tell him, face to face, what his leadership had meant to them. But before they left, Colonel Mitchell asked if he could address the townspeople who had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I want you to know that you've been living among genuine American heroes. Martin Sullivan is one of the finest men I've ever known, and one of the bravest. He gave the best years of his life to serving his country, and he did it without ever asking for recognition or reward." He paused, looking around at the faces of people who were seeing their neighbor in an entirely new light. He came here because he wanted to live quietly, to be left alone with his memories. I hope you'll respect that. But I also hope you'll understand that the man you've been walking past every day for the past 12 years is someone very special. He's someone who deserves your respect, your gratitude, and your friendship. The colonel's words had a profound effect on the assembled townspeople. When the visitors finally departed, driving off into the evening darkness, the people of Millbrook were left to contemplate the extraordinary revelation that had been dropped into their ordinary lives. Martin Sullivan, the man they had barely noticed, was a hero. Not in the abstract sense of someone who had simply served his country, but in the very real sense of someone who had repeatedly risked his life to protect others, who had made decisions under impossible circumstances, who had carried the weight of responsibility for other people's lives and had never faltered under that burden. In the days that followed, the entire dynamic of the town changed. People who had never given Martin a second thought now found themselves watching for him on his morning walks. They would nod respectfully when they saw him, and some of the braver ones would even offer a quiet "good morning" or "thank you for your service." Martin, for his part, seemed to accept the changed atmosphere with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his years in Millbrook. He continued his daily routine, but there was something different about him too. The rigid isolation he had maintained for so long seemed to soften slightly. He would return greetings when offered, and occasionally he would even stop to exchange a few words with neighbors who approached him respectfully. The change was most evident in his relationship with Jared, who had been the first to recognize what Martin represented. The younger man had earned Martin's respect through his genuine interest and his discretion in handling the information he had been given. Gradually, Martin began to open up to him, sharing small pieces of his story in conversations that occurred during chance encounters on the street or in the grocery store. "You know," Martin said one morning as they happened to be walking in the same direction, "I came here because I wanted to disappear. I thought I could just blend in, become invisible." "And you did," Jared replied. "For 12 years, you were invisible, but maybe that's not what you really needed." Martin was quiet for a long moment, considering this. "Maybe not," he finally agreed. "Maybe what I needed was to be seen but not judged, to be known but not celebrated." It was a profound observation, and it captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred in Millbrook. The townspeople had learned to see Martin not as a curiosity or a source of gossip, but as a neighbor who happened to have an extraordinary past. They treated him with the respect he deserved without making him feel like a specimen in a museum. But Martin's past wasn't finished with him yet, and neither was the town's biggest secret. 3 months after the reunion with his former teammates, Martin received another unexpected visitor. This one came alone, in a nondescript sedan that pulled up to his house on a gray December morning when the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. The visitor was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, with the kind of bearing that suggested government work. She knocked on Martin's door at exactly 9 o'clock, and when he answered, she showed him credentials that made his face go pale. "Mr. Sullivan, my name is Director Sarah Chen, Central Intelligence Agency. I need to speak with you about Operation Phantom Ridge." Martin's hand tightened on the doorframe. Operation Phantom Ridge was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 47 years. It was a mission that officially never happened, conducted by men who officially were never there, in a place that officially didn't exist on any map. "I think you have the wrong person," Martin said carefully, but his voice lacked conviction. Director Chen smiled grimly. "Mr. Sullivan, we both know that's not true. May I come in? What I have to discuss with you is a matter of national security. Martin hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her enter. As she passed him, he instinctively checked the street to see if anyone was watching. Across the square, he could see Mrs. Henderson at the post office window, and he knew that by lunchtime, the entire town would know he'd had an official visitor. Director Chen took a seat in Martin's modest living room, her eyes automatically cataloging the sparse furnishings, the precisely arranged books, the single photograph on the mantel that showed a group of young Marines in jungle fatigues. She had done her homework on Martin Sullivan, and she knew she was dealing with someone who had spent decades learning to keep secrets. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to be direct with you. We need your help. Martin remained standing, his arms crossed. I've been retired for 23 years. Whatever you need, I'm sure you can find someone younger and more capable. Not for this, Director Chen said firmly. Operation Phantom Ridge has been classified for nearly 5 decades, but circumstances have changed. We have reason to believe that certain information from that mission has been compromised, and we need someone who was there to help us verify what intelligence may have been leaked. Martin's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Who else knows about this? Only a handful of people at the highest levels. The operation is still classified, and it will remain so. But we need to know exactly what happened during the 3 weeks you and your team were behind enemy lines in Cambodia. The room fell silent. Martin walked to the window and looked out at the town square, where normal people were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that their quiet neighbor was being asked to revisit the most dangerous mission of his military career. Those 3 weeks, Martin said quietly, are not something I talk about. Ever. I understand that, Mr. Sullivan. But lives may be at stake. American lives. Martin turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Director Chen saw the full weight of the man she was dealing with. His eyes held the kind of intensity that came from making life and death decisions in impossible circumstances. If I help you, Martin said, I would do it my way. No recordings, no transcripts, no official reports. Just you, me, and whatever information you need to protect American interests. Director Chen nodded. Agreed. What followed was a conversation that lasted 4 hours and revealed details of a mission that had been so classified that only 7 people in the world knew the complete story. Martin had been the team leader for an operation that had penetrated deep into enemy territory to gather intelligence on a weapons cache that could have changed the course of the war. The mission had gone wrong almost from the beginning. They had been compromised, surrounded, and forced to fight their way out through hostile territory with information that was vital to American forces. For 3 weeks they had evaded capture while making their way back to friendly lines, carrying intelligence that had ultimately saved thousands of American lives. But there had been a cost. Of the 12 men who had gone in, only 7 had come out. The 5 who had died had been left behind. Their bodies never recovered. Their families never told the true circumstances of their deaths. Now, Director Chen was telling Martin that someone had been selling information about classified operations to foreign governments, and Operation Phantom Ridge was one of the missions that had been compromised. We need to know exactly what intelligence you gathered, she said, and we need to know who else might have had access to that information. Martin provided the answers she needed, his memory of the mission as clear as if it had happened yesterday. But when she finally left, he was left with a profound sense of unease. The past he had worked so hard to bury was not only refusing to stay buried, it was actively reaching out to reclaim him. That evening, as Martin was preparing his simple dinner, he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Jared standing on his porch, looking concerned. "Mr. Sullivan, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I saw that woman leave earlier, and you looked, well, you looked troubled." Martin studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine concern rather than curiosity. Over the past few months, Jared had proven himself to be trustworthy, someone who understood the value of discretion. "Would you like to come in?" Martin asked. "I think I could use some company." It was the first time Martin had ever invited anyone into his home, and Jared understood the significance of the gesture. He followed Martin into the living room, where the older man poured 2 glasses of bourbon and sat down heavily in his chair. "Sometimes," Martin said after a long silence, "the past doesn't let you go, even when you think you've escaped it." Jared waited, sensing that Martin needed to talk but wouldn't be rushed. "That woman today, she was asking me about things I've spent 47 years trying to forget. About men who died because of decisions I made. About missions that were supposed to stay secret forever." Martin took a sip of his bourbon, his eyes distant. "Do you know what the hardest part of military service is, Jared? It's not the danger or the fear or even watching your friends die. It's coming home and realizing that the person you were before you left doesn't exist anymore. That you've become someone your family and friends don't recognize. Someone who carries stories they could never understand." "Is that why you came to Millbrook?" Jared asked gently. "To become someone new?" Martin nodded. "I thought I could just disappear, become ordinary, but today reminded me that some things can never be ordinary, no matter how much time passes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Martin spoke again. "The men who visited me here a few months ago, they were my family for a time. We went through things together that bonded us in ways that civilian relationships never could. But we also carried burdens that we couldn't share with anyone else. And now? Now I'm being asked to revisit those burdens, to remember details I've worked hard to forget, to relive decisions that I've never been sure were right." Jared leaned forward. "Mr. Sullivan, I may not understand what you went through, but I know something about carrying stories that feel too heavy to share. Maybe the burden isn't supposed to be carried alone." Martin looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "This town has changed since they learned about your service. People look at you differently now, not because they see you as a curiosity, but because they see you as someone who deserves respect. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from who you were and start embracing who you are." The words hung in the air between them, challenging Martin's carefully constructed isolation. For 47 years, he had been running from his past, but maybe it was time to stop running and start living with it. Over the following weeks, Martin found himself thinking more and more about Jared's words. The town had indeed changed, but perhaps the most significant change was in himself. The rigid control he had maintained for so long was beginning to soften, and he was discovering that sharing his burden, even in small ways, was making it lighter rather than heavier. He began to open up more to his neighbors, not about the classified details of his service, but about the human cost of war, the challenges of coming home, the difficulty of carrying memories that couldn't be shared. The people of Millbrook, in turn, began to see him not as a mysterious figure from their past, but as a neighbor who had given more than most in service to his country. The transformation reached its peak on Memorial Day, when the town held its annual ceremony at the small cemetery on the edge of town. For the first time in 12 years, Martin attended. He stood quietly at the back of the crowd as the names of local war dead were read. And when the ceremony concluded, people began to approach him. They didn't ask him about his missions or his medals. Instead, they thanked him for his service, shared stories of their own family members who had served, and welcomed him into the community in a way that felt natural and unforced. But the most meaningful moment came when young Johnny Morrison, the grandson of one of the town's World War II veterans, approached Martin with a simple question. That evening, as Martin was preparing his simple dinner, he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Jared standing on his porch, looking concerned. "Mr. Sullivan, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I saw that woman leave earlier, and you looked troubled." Martin studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine concern rather than curiosity. Over the past few months, Jared had proven himself to be trustworthy, someone who understood the value of discretion. "Would you like to come in?" Martin asked. "I think I could use some company." It was the first time Martin had ever invited anyone into his home, and Jared understood the significance of the gesture. He followed Martin into the living room, where the older man poured 2 glasses of bourbon and sat down heavily in his chair. "Sometimes," Martin said after a long silence, "the past doesn't let you go, even when you think you've escaped it." Jared waited, sensing that Martin needed to talk but wouldn't be rushed. "That woman today, she was asking me about things I've spent 47 years trying to forget. About men who died because of decisions I made. About missions that were supposed to stay secret forever." Martin took a sip of his bourbon, his eyes distant. "Do you know what the hardest part of military service is, Jared? It's not the danger or the fear or even watching your friends die. It's coming home and realizing that the person you were before you left doesn't exist anymore. That you've become someone your family and friends don't recognize, someone who carries stories they could never understand." "Is that why you came to Millbrook?" Jared asked gently. "To become someone new?" Martin nodded. "I thought I could just disappear, become ordinary. But today reminded me that some things can never be ordinary, no matter how much time passes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Martin spoke again. "The men who visited me a few months ago, they were my family for a time. We went through things together that bonded us in ways that civilian relationships never could. But we also carried burdens that we couldn't share with anyone else. And now? Now I'm being asked to revisit those burdens, to remember details I've worked hard to forget, to relive decisions that I've never been sure were right." Jared leaned forward. "Mr. Sullivan, I may not understand what you went through, but I know something about carrying stories that feel too heavy to share. Maybe the burden isn't supposed to be carried alone." Martin looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "This town has changed since they learned about your service. People look at you differently now, not because they see you as a curiosity, but because they see you as someone who deserves respect. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from who you were and start embracing who you are." The words hung in the air between them, challenging Martin's carefully constructed isolation. For 47 years, he had been running from his past. But maybe it was time to stop running and start living with it. Over the following weeks, Martin found himself thinking more and more about Jared's words. The town had indeed changed, but perhaps the most significant change was in himself. The rigid control he had maintained for so long was beginning to soften, and he was discovering that sharing his burden, even in small ways, was making it lighter rather than heavier. He began to open up more to his neighbors, not about the classified details of his service, but about the human cost of war, the challenges of coming home, the difficulty of carrying memories that couldn't be shared. The people of Millbrook, in turn, began to see him not as a mysterious figure from their past, but as a neighbor who had given more than most in service to his country. The transformation reached its peak on Memorial Day, when the town held its annual ceremony at the small cemetery on the edge of town. For the first time in 12 years, Martin attended. He stood quietly at the back of the crowd as the names of local war dead were read. And when the ceremony concluded, people began to approach him. They didn't ask him about his missions or his medals. Instead, they thanked him for his service, shared stories of their own family members who had served, and welcomed him into the community in a way that felt natural and unforced. But the most meaningful moment came when young Johnny Morrison, the grandson of one of the town's World War II veterans, approached Martin with a simple question. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more heartfelt tales about identity, healing, and belonging. Every story is a small step toward understanding the bigger picture of what it means to be human.